Welcome to this video on confidence intervals. This video will answer the following questions. What is a confidence interval? What are the important pieces of a confidence interval? And how do you create a confidence interval for quantitative data and for categorical or qualitative data? So what is a confidence interval? Simply stated, a confidence interval is a range of values. You have a given degree of certainty or confidence that the true value of whatever you're measuring lies in between two values, a lower limit and an upper limit. A good example of this is cooking or baking. Recipes usually give a range of values for how long things have to cook or bake. For example, a cookie recipe might say bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 to 11 minutes. 8 to 11 minutes is a confidence interval. So let's take a minute and think about why variations in baking times exist. If you'd like, you can pause this video, write down some of your ideas, and then unpause it to see how many I mention. One answer is that there are different sized pans. Sometimes pans are made of different materials, which may cause baking times to vary. Some people have different preferences of food doneness. For example, some people like very crisp or crunchy brownies or cookies. Other people prefer them to be softer or moister. Also, ovens may run hot or cold. Even though your oven says that it's heated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, it might be slightly warmer or colder than that. These are just a few reasons that variations in baking times exist. If you look at this image, it's actually a screenshot from the back of a brownie box. As you can see here, they've already tried to control for some of these variables. They have different ranges of baking times depending on the size and material of the pan. However, despite controlling for these variables, we can see that they're still giving us a confidence interval. They're still providing a range of values that we need to bake these brownies for. So let's see what a confidence interval really looks like. We always create a confidence interval on a number line. We plot the lower limit and the upper limit on the number line. Let's use this concrete example. Suppose a recipe has a baking time of 18 to 20 minutes. So the lower limit is 18 minutes and the upper limit is 20 minutes. Halfway in between the lower limit and the upper limit is what we call our point estimate. In this case, halfway between 18 and 20 is 19. One way to calculate this is to sum the upper and lower limit. In this example, 18 plus 20 is 38, and then divide by 2. 38 divided by 2 is 19. We also have the margin of error. The margin of error is the distance between the lower limit and the point estimate, and the distance between the point estimate and the upper limit. In our example, both margins of error, they're always the same, are 1 minute. It's important to understand that the margin of error is always regarded as positive. We never have a negative margin of error. So the first thing we have to do if we're going to construct a confidence interval is decide what type of data we're working with. The two types of data are quantitative and categorical or qualitative. If we're working with quantitative data, we will collect data of sample size n and calculate the sample mean x bar in order to estimate our population mean mu. If we're working with categorical or qualitative data, again, we will also collect data of sample size n, but this time, instead of calculating the sample mean x bar, we will calculate the sample proportion p hat in order to estimate the population proportion p. Remember, all of this is part of inferential statistics. In inferential statistics, we take a sample of the population in order to make inferences about the population as a whole. It's important that we only sample less than 10% of the population if we are to regard our samples as independent or think of them as being without replacement. When we construct confidence intervals, we are estimating the population mean or the population proportion using data from the sample. Let's start with an example of working with categorical data. If we're working with categorical data, we will be given a point estimate p hat, which is our sample proportion. If you have a data set, then you will have to use software or technology to calculate the point estimate. Otherwise, you will probably just be given the point estimate in the problem statement. We still have a lower and upper limit. The way we find the lower limit is by subtracting the margin of error from the point estimate, and the way we find the upper limit is by adding the margin of error to the point estimate. We also need to label our margins of error and remember that they are always considered positive. So how do we calculate our margin of error? Well, we can do this by hand using the formula you see there, or we can use technology to generate the confidence interval. Again, remember your margin of error is always positive. What if we're working with quantitative data? Then what will our confidence interval look like? Again, we always start with a number line. This time, we are going to have a sample mean be our point estimate. Remember, x bar represents our sample mean. If you have a set of data, you will have to use technology to calculate the sample mean. If you have a summary of the data, then the sample mean will be given to you. From the point estimate, we will have to calculate the lower and upper limits by subtracting and adding the margin of error. Again, the margin of error is the distance from the lower limit to the point estimate, and then from the point estimate to the upper limit. You can calculate the margin of error either using this by hand formula, or you can use technology to generate the confidence interval. Again, remember your margin of error is always positive. Here's a summary of how to construct a confidence interval. Let's look at the differences between the two. So if we have quantitative data, our point estimate is our sample mean x bar. If we have categorical data, our point estimate is our sample proportion p hat. In both cases, our margin of error has to be calculated either by hand or using technology. Notice we have two different equations depending on whether we're working with categorical data or quantitative data. And again, in both cases, the margin of error will always be positive.